verse 17 thereabouts. But to recap last week, we did discuss Romans 2. We talked about major themes that were in Romans 2. So that included law. Chapter 2 is one of those few chapters in which God is actually, if you look at it just from a count of terms, it's not quite as frequently used as law. Let me just back up to that slide. One of the very few in the book of Romans. And law is the most prevalent theme in the book. And we start seeing those references to law about verse 12. Again, God is on the slide there. It is right there in the green on the left part of the slide. And most of the references to God in this chapter are either about his judgment or those he will justify. Of course, Jews and Gentiles, frequently the references aren't directly to those terms, but to things that are related to that roll up into that, like circumcised and uncircumcised. And then judgment. We've got the Jews judging the Gentiles. That's one context in which that term or related terms are using, is being used. And then the Jews, they're judging them for doing things against the law, mentioned the end of 1, but Paul says you're guilty of the same things. And he tells them you're not going to escape God's judgment. So that's another way that we see judgment used as well. If you like to think in terms of outlines, here's it so far. It's short to this point, but you got the introductory piece in the first half of Romans 1. In the second half of Romans 1, you've got the Gentiles being lost, and in what we've studied in chapter 2, and pretty much all of chapter 2, the focus is shifting to the Jews being lost as well, and their status as Jews, as God's chosen people, so to speak, doesn't save them in and of itself. We talked about verse 6 and how it says that God will render to each one according to his works. And we know where Paul is going eventually with Romans, that you can't be justified by works. You can't work your way to salvation. So if everyone gets what they deserve, it's not going to work out well for any of us. But Paul's purpose in saying that is really just kind of scare the Jews straight, to get them out of this mindset of depending on the law to save them, and toward the mindset of putting their faith in God to do for them what they can't through Jesus. And we discussed that we frequently pull verse 6 out of context by using it just by itself and not really in line with that contextual intent of helping people to realize that they shouldn't be dependent on law to save them. A little later on, I'll hit verses 14 and 15 as well, and we talked about that kind of, law of conscience, the Gentiles not having the law, not having the old law, but they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts while their conscience also bears witness. So we introduce this idea of the law of conscience that helps us understand the Gentiles were under some form of law themselves, not the Mosaic law, but what we frequently refer to as the law of conscience. And that gets us pretty close to where we wrapped up coming into to verse 17. So you may want to keep your Bibles open here. A lot of times I show the slides on the screen just like this and speak to them, but I'm actually going to skip ahead to another view of this. Hopefully that's readable. There's some, being a Jew brought with it several advantages indeed, but it also brought with it several responsibilities. So on the advantages side, they had a special name. They're God's chosen people. So verse 17 says, you who call yourself a Jew. Verse 17 also says they rely on the law. So we know they had God's law. They had the old law. They know who the real God is. Verse 17 also says that they boasted in him as if to say, we have him and you Gentiles don't. Verse 18, being his chosen people and having his law, they are aware of what his will is, and they supposedly approve what is excellent because of the law, also according to verse 18. And I say supposedly because actually if we hop back here, if you call yourself a Jew, right? There's some conditions on that. If you have all these advantages, then what are your responsibilities? He gets into those starting in verse 19 on the right side of the slide. They're a guide. They should be a guide to the blind, a light to those in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, and a teacher of children. When you look at the object of these things, a guide to the blind. So remember, they're Jews. They've got God's law. They know who the real God is and what his will is. They approve of what is excellent. If these are then their responsibilities, they're a guide to the blind, light to those in darkness. Think about the object side of this, right? They're instructor of the foolish. They're a teacher of children. So the object's kind of on the right side here. Who's the object? Who's that really describing? Who should they be a guide to? Who didn't have the law? The Gentiles. They really ought to be kind of pointing the way, right? The Gentiles had the law of conscience, but the Jews should have been kind of pointing the way to God. They were God's chosen people. They had the old law. So the Jews have these responsibilities that, frankly, they were failing at filling. And because when it came to those responsibilities, the next few verses tell us a little bit more. We see specifically in verses 21 to 23 a few things, that they taught others but not themselves, that they stole while preaching against stealing, that they said one must not commit adultery, but they did so themselves. Jesus says as much in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 27 through 32, where he goes into how they tried to bend the law to justify their own adulterous behavior. They hated idols. Yet it's believed that they went into pagan temples and took the gold for themselves in some instances. As a matter of fact, Josephus, totally outside of Scripture, but a historical writer at the time, records an incident where 4 Jewish men were convicted after convincing a Gentile convert. So this isn't even in a pagan temple, okay? But after convincing a Gentile convert to make a large donation to the Jewish temple, and then fraudulently took the money themselves. So these are the things that are, just Josephus wrote about it, so it's probably kind of known about during their day, I would suppose. So, and then also it says they boasted in the law, but broke it themselves. If you have a law and you boast about being one of God's chosen people, yet you don't follow, you break that law, you're dishonoring God. And that's exactly what the Jews had done. In fact, verse 24 talks about God's name being blasphemed among the Gentiles because of their actions. It's easy to look at these few verses and kind of want to beat up on the Jews. But guess what? We've got the gospel, and there's a world in darkness around us. Are we living up to our responsibilities to be kind of, look at the responsibilities back over here, a guide to the blind, a light to those in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children? Are we living up to our responsibilities as well? I'm not saying that, we're under the new covenant, right? I'm not saying we've got to be perfect in terms of, we think about this standard and living up to the law and things like that. Justin preached this morning, did really well. I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking more about looking internally at our own shortcomings instead of piling on those of others. Part of realizing just how blessed we are that God provides a way for us to be justified, for us to be made righteous, is to not pile on the shortcomings of others, but focus on the man in the mirror more, and trying to be that servant, that slave that just is that appreciates that benevolent master so much that we'll do whatever we can for him. Going on to verses 25 to 29, we know from the Old Testament that Jews had a two-way covenant with God. I'm sorry, that's not all that readable, is it? Sorry, that font color's not the best. But anyway, they had a two-way covenant with God. both parties have responsibilities in a two-way covenant. So I've got Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6 down here in the bottom right. And let's read that real quick. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So how many parties again? You got two that have a responsibility in that old covenant. You've got Israel and you've got God. It says, if you keep my covenant, essentially, then I will be your God. Both parties have responsibilities there, but the Jews failed to keep their end of the covenant. And that if, now therefore, if you will do these things, look, if, you're starting to see some conditional things talked about here in Romans chapter 2 as well, in that bold blue font. And it's saying, in this case, that circumcision is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision, and the Jews indeed broke the law. Then in verse 26, the if is about some Gentiles who kept the law better than some of the Israelites themselves. If a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision, it says. The Jews had a heart condition. They had the law, but they wouldn't keep it. Meanwhile, some Gentiles, like Cornelius, we talked about him as an example, wouldn't have the Mosaic law per se, but they could sense that there was a God, and they would seek after him, and they would in that way more effectively keep the law than many of the Jews did. Not to make you do math, but there are a couple of equations in this passage that we can infer from it, at least, verses 26 and 27. Circumcision minus obedience equals uncircumcision. In other words, if you're a Jew and you hold the law and all those things, but you fail to obey it, it's just the same as being uncircumcised. It's the same as being a Gentile or not one of God's chosen people. But if you are one of those individuals and you obey, you seek after God, you try to do what it is that he wants you to do, then that's essentially being one of his chosen people. That's really what those verses are saying. And verses 28 and 29 really summarize the takeaway there, where it says, for no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. When Paul refers to a Jew in these verses, he's talking more so about what it means to be one of God's chosen people than a Jew in name only. That doesn't have anything to do with outward things. That has everything to do with trusting God to do for me what I can't do for myself. That obedience of faith in which we want to do everything that we can for that benevolent master for all that he's done for us. Remember, the starting point of chapter 2 was that these Jews were acting like they could do the exact same things they're judging the Gentiles of being guilty of and still be fine themselves. Refer back to verses 1 and 3 on that. The point of their status, the point is that their status as Jews didn't give them any favored treatment over the Gentiles, and that's not because there was anything wrong with the law of Moses. The law itself was perfectly fine. So as we're bringing chapter 2 to a close, I want to talk about a couple of key points, and then we'll open it up for any questions or comments before we get into chapter 3. But one, some people will look at this, and we talk about the law of conscience, things like that, the state that the Gentiles are in, and they'll say something like, well, why do we even take the gospel to Africa? Or they'll pick some far away land that there might be individuals that have never heard of it, where it's almost like they think that they would be better off never hearing of God when it comes to judgment. And the general idea is, well, if there's something like a law of conscience, why don't we just allow people to, be judged by that? Let's get one thing straight. The gospel is a solution here. It's not the problem. It's not related to the problem. And we've got some responsibilities in that regard. We've used Cornelius as an example when we talked in, you can read about him in Acts 10, but of a Gentile who was probably, who probably followed this law of conscience very well. But we also have the benefit of being able to look ahead. And what's Paul going to tell us in chapter 3 and verse 10? How many are righteous?
No, not one.
None. None are righteous. No, not one. That's exactly right. So even Cornelius, nobody can make themselves righteous before God just by trying to follow works, following the law. Cornelius couldn't. Jews couldn't. Gentiles couldn't. You can't. I can't. Nobody can do that. And Paul's already shown the Gentiles they're not righteous in chapter 1. He's done the same thing with the Jews here in chapter 2. So, the gospel is not, it's a solution. It's not in any way part of a problem or something that we should, try to shove under the rug and not worry about taking over there. Secondly, Paul begins to redefine what it is to be a Jew in verses 26 to 29. And he'll expand on that greatly in chapter 9. I encourage you to read that if you want. We're not going to get there this quarter. You can tell we're not just, blowing it through Romans here, and that's not my intent. For here, the point is to be a true member of God's chosen family has to do with having your heart changed. It's not about outward or ritualistic signs or things like that. It's real internal changes that are part of being a child of God. And how we view how God justifies us is one of those changes we're going to dive into over the next few chapters in Romans. Questions, comments, anything you'd like to discuss before we jump into chapter 3?
There are a lot of, quote, Christians who are outward but not inward, using your left corner. They have not obeyed, even though they wear the name.
Yes, sir. And I think, again, if you missed this morning, go back and watch it, because I think Justin hit on that this morning very well, because there's a starting point for all that, right? And it is an obedience of faith. There is obedience involved in it, okay? There's certain things that he'll get into, but, we want to do what we can for that benevolent master. And if we're not doing anything, then, maybe that is just, some kind of blind faith or faith without work, so to speak, right? Where it's just, there's nothing there. We're not responding in any way. And I don't think that's Paul's intent at all in writing this letter. He's more, he's telling the Jews at least, you can't work your way into salvation. But that doesn't mean that your life won't be characterized by, doing things for the Lord. Again, and I think when he talks about being a slave and what you'll either be, you're going to be slaves to one thing or the other. Again, not getting ahead of myself, but he's going to talk about those things as well coming up. Others? Let's go into chapter 3 then, if we can get that one pulled up. All right. And I think we touched on most of this already, so I don't think I need to belabor the topic here and go into that again. I'm just going to hop into chapter 3, the themes that are in chapter 3. And so again, that we see that God, again, is the most used theme in this chapter. And specifically, we'll talk about his righteousness a good deal in chapter 3. And that feeds right into the next topic, which is righteous, which is right there on top. And again, these are, it's not just like pure word counts, right? Righteousness is a theme that includes righteousness and righteous, justify and justification, and it even includes like unrighteousness, let's say, like the negative parts of that, because the topic is still, that's under consideration is still righteousness at the end of the day. So all that's summed up in righteous. Let's see here. Chapter 3 includes a high-level view of how God justifies man or makes man righteous in his sight. And in verse 21 and forward, the frequency of those words pick up significantly. The third term we'll talk about is law, which is just below God and to the left of it in orange. It's a significant topic, but again, it doesn't even appear until verse 19. in chapter 3. So that means it's a significant topic, so it's going to appear a good bit once it starts to appear. At that particular point, though, it's about showing that by the law, no one's going to be justified. You can jump ahead to verse 20 or so if you want to see that. But verse 21 in chapter 3 is kind of the turning point of Romans. Remember, I've been talking about we're in the bad news, and we're going to be there for quite a while till we get into the good news. And verse 21 is where that happens. So thank you for spending a quarter and a half with me in bad news. We'll get out of it finally. And then faith is also there in green and slightly to the right below the term God. And this is another one of those words where we combine terms like faith and believe and belief, because the root word is the same in the Greek. It's the same idea. And the initial mentions of faith are in the negative sense. So for an example, take a look at verse 3 if you want to see that. But we go for quite a stretch without nothing mentioned about faith until we get to verse 22, kind of when you're getting into that stretch where it's the turning point of Romans, where it mentions the righteousness of faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. So the mentions from faith from that point forward are generally positive mentions in the book of Romans. That's all the ones I'm going to talk about, but you can see some of the other terms that are there as well. You've seen a lot of these terms already. So the first batch of verses we'll talk about are 1 through 4. And so remember, the latter half of chapter 1 is kind of Paul beating up on the Gentiles a bit, and then chapter 2 is, for the most part, Paul beating up on the Jews. So understand how the Jews would have reacted to what they heard from Paul in chapter 2. To him, what Paul wrote there is probably an affront to everything, the way they had been raised and everything they were used to, everything they grew up around, and culture and traditions that had been built upon for a long, long time by this point. And, they would have known that they were God's chosen people. That's just how they would have been brought up and what their whole worldview would have been around. And Paul knows that, and so he starts to set up these diatribes in chapter 3. So a diatribe is just a literary device. It was often used by the philosophers of that day. But generally the way it works is you've got a teacher who's wanting to teach an audience something, and the way that he works is he will set up a dialogue with his critics. He will pose questions that he's sure they're going to ask, and then he'll answer those questions. And so this isn't his first. If you go back to chapter 2 and verse 1, and you can look in chapter 2 and verse 17, he's already been using this, and he'll continue to use it in several places throughout Romans. It's not the first time he's done that. It's very likely that he's using arguments that he used to use. Remember Paul's background and how he came to be a Christian, and he persecuted Christians before he became one. And so he's probably well aware of the arguments from that. But also in his work as a Christian, he was kind of a synagogue evangelist, let's say, right? He would do a lot of his evangelizing there by targeting the synagogues in essence. And you could imagine that after he's become a Christian and he's teaching there, that he might have a heckler, who's just saying, well, what about this, Paul? What about that? And over this course of time, he would have picked up arguments, whether it was him doing it himself before he was persecuting Christians, or when he was persecuting Christians, or whether it's a heckler that's doing that to him when he's a Christian himself. Or maybe it's a combination of that. But you can generally just imagine Paul being in a synagogue setting and hearing things like, well, then what advantage has the Jew, for instance, right? From a heckler saying, well, tell me why we would even care about being a Jew anyway. What would that help us? And then him just spending a little bit answering that, following that bit of logic. Let's see here. Again, there's a lot of elaboration on these topics more in depth in chapters 9 to 11, but you're going to see that, Paul is really trying to handle the objections that would come from what he said in those last few verses of Romans 2 that we summarized. The Cliff's Notes of that is, there's no difference between Jews and Gentiles. We're all in the same boat. We're all the same at the foot of the cross, essentially. And just because you're a Jew, you're not immune when it comes to God's judgment. Paul is filling the role of the heckler then when he says that right there in verse 1, then what advantage has a Jew? And he's just redefined what a Jew is. And then in what he's done so far, twice already, he's said that phrase to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Like he's admitting in some way that there's an advantage to being a Jew just by using that phrase, right, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. He does that in chapter 1 and verse 16, the Gospels, the power of God for salvation to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And then in chapter 2 and verse 9, he describes judgment for everyone who's judged by law, tribulation and distress for the Jew first and also to the Greek, right? So kind of in a positive and a negative sense, both. But by phrasing things that way, he's admitting that there's some kind of advantage to being a Jew, and this is a valid question that someone might ask then what advantage is there to being a Jew? And in answering that, he's going to keep this diatribe going for some time. This is a string of back and forth kind of question and answer responses with the heckler. You can jump ahead to chapter 9 where he says, what then? Are we Jews any better off? In verse 27, he says, then what becomes of our boasting? In chapter 4 and verse 1, what then shall we say was gained by Abraham? So all of these are that diatribe kind of argument where he's going to pose a question, as, I just kind of picture a heckler, right? He's going to pose a question that they might ask, and then he's going to answer it. And indeed, so coming back to this portion of Romans 4, indeed the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. That's one advantage. God gave his law to them, but they didn't keep it. Here's the Jews who get God's law. When God gives us something, we have a responsibility. And in essence, the advantage was that God made them responsible for his law. No other nation, no other group of people had that privilege. But that doesn't mean that they themselves were secure just by being holders of his law. And that's what Paul's point's going to be here. There was nothing wrong with the Mosaic law itself. Absolutely nothing wrong with the Mosaic law. So Paul's just going down these paths that the heckler's flawed logic might take them. And as someone who was on that side, he would be very familiar with where that logic might take them. He says in verse 3, if some were unfaithful, does that nullify God's faithfulness? In other words, if some Jews didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, does that in some way make God unfaithful? And certainly not. So we think about these oracles of God and what was included in them. Remember we talked in the overview lesson and mentions of the gospel were part of that? There were things that were pointing to the coming of Christ that were there. So the good news, the promise of the Messiah in Isaiah chapter 52 and 53 that we talked about, and then the following there, the mentions of the suffering servant, for instance. If the Jews refused to see that fulfilled in the coming of Jesus when they were the holders of God's oracles, then that was on them. That wasn't on God for not revealing it to them. It was on them. Just because I believe something that's untrue, or I fail to believe something that is true, right? It doesn't make it, in the first case, it doesn't make it true or it doesn't make it untrue, right? Just because I fail to believe a truth doesn't make me right, okay? And that's kind of what the Jews were thinking here. To those with that background, just because they were a Jew and as such one of God's chosen people doesn't mean that they could set aside the facts of what God had done for them. Verse 4, just in case the question he posed there in verse 3, just in case that the answer isn't rhetorical on its own. He says, by no means. And you'll see in other translations, may it never be, or God forbid, or lots of different ways that's worded. I want you to make a note of everywhere you see that. It's helpful to do that in Romans. And often he's speaking in this diatribe setup. When he's doing that, he's speaking in that format, and it helps you to kind of understand, what he's saying, and you can follow that logic along the way. So he says it again in verse 6. We'll see it in just a moment. Verse 31. I can send you these references if you want them. Chapter 6, he says it in two places, verses 2 and 15. Chapter 7, verses 7 and 13. Chapter 9 and verse 14. So make a note when you see that, though, and it magnifies how illogical these arguments are that these hecklers or people who hold this view have. He says in verse 4, let God be true, though everyone were a liar. God's the arbiter of truth. We are not. Man is not the arbiter of truth. No man, Jew or otherwise, is in the position to dictate what truth is. God's the one that formed the heavens and the earth and us. So saying what truth is his role. And he sent Jesus Christ to be the Savior of man. Even if everybody on the planet didn't believe in Jesus, would that change the truth of who he is? Not one bit. Right? It'd still be truth. That would still be fact. So continuing in verse 4, as it is written that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you're judged. Where's that come from? Probably, you might have a footnote in your Bible. Psalm 51 and verse 4. Psalm 51 and verse 4. The Jews know the Old Testament scriptures. Paul's about to be getting into a string. He's already kind of touched on it, right? And we talked about, some things we established at the outset of Isaiah 52 and 53, and he told them the gospel's coming, those kind of things. He's about to just give them a litany of Old Testament scriptures that they can go through. So Psalm 51:4 here, Paul brings to their mind one of these scriptures that I guess they know, but they don't know, frankly. It's a passage written by David after Nathan confronted David about his sin with Bathsheba. And we brought this up during our class on chapter 2, where David was outraged over the ewe lamb that the rich man had taken from the poor man, and Nathan turns the tables and says, "You are the man." Paul's reminding these Christians of Jewish descent that they're the ones who are judging others for doing things that they themselves have done. God's law is perfect, and just because people didn't keep it correctly 100%, that didn't change the fact that the Mosaic law, there was nothing wrong with the Mosaic law itself. So when it says that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you're judged, it's saying that God is just in rendering his judgment according to the law. Okay, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged, right? So that's the way David says it in Psalm 54, if you read it there, and I think this is out of the ESV, but nonetheless it says, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Now, David's saying to God in that, I fully admit that I'm in the wrong. The problem's not with you, Lord, the problem's with me. David is making that admission, and Paul's trying to get the Jews to see the same thing, that the problem isn't with God, it wasn't with his law, it was with them, and they didn't live up to it. Verses 5 and 8, or 5 through 8. Let's read verses 5 and 6. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means, for then how could God judge the world? So Paul's just following this flawed logic to, a little bit further down. And when he speaks in that, he speaks in that parenthetical where he says, I speak in a human way, he's just saying, I'm following this flawed logic. He's explaining that, okay? And he strongly made the case that everyone, Jews, Gentiles, everyone, are in sin, they're unrighteous, they don't measure up to whatever standard the law sets, whatever the law they're under. If you did not have the opportunity to partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, please make your way down the hall and you will be served. I think it's room 105. So, but he's made the case that Jews and Gentiles are all in sin. They're not going to live up to the standard of the law. And with his words targeted at the Jews here, he's saying, is God unrighteous to inflict wrath on those who are unrighteous? Right? If we want to stand before God in judgment based on the law, he's saying, is God then unrighteous to inflict wrath on those who are unrighteous? If we're not righteous by keeping the law, how could we say that God is unrighteous by giving us what we deserve? Right? If we depended on the law and, we were staunch supporters of it, and we can't say that God is unrighteous by giving us the wrath that we would deserve from that law. If I've broken God's law and he punishes me, he's righteous for doing so. He's given me what I've earned. And we see his response again in verse 6, by no means. May it never be, or God forbid, or however your translation reads. Again, if I lived my life great and I stole $100,000 from the bank, but I otherwise lived a perfect life except for that one thing, and I go before the judge, and the judge looks at my case, and the judge says, I can't find another thing anywhere that you've done wrong, and for that, I'm going to declare you innocent. Is that just? It's not just, is it? Right? That judge is being partial to me. That judge is being unfair to my benefit, but that's not a just or a right judgment. We might even go so far as to say it's an unrighteous judgment in that case. And here you've got the Jews who've had the law of Moses and they feel above punishment. They feel like they have privileged status. Effectively, they're making God out to be an unjust God by presuming that he's just going to let it slide for them when he's going to punish the Gentiles for the exact same things. So verse 6, essentially God can't judge the world if he's an unrighteous judge. He'd be unfit for the role. Then in verses 7 and 8, but if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner, and why not do evil that good may come? As some people slanderously charge us with saying, their condemnation is just. So Paul's continuing to follow that flawed logic of the heckler and where it might go, and the verses are effectively saying, well, if my unrighteousness shows the goodness of God, then, and he's glorified through that, isn't that a good thing? And shouldn't I just keep on doing evil so that he can be more glorified? And it ought to be blatantly obvious by this point that that's just really flawed logic. But because we're seeing it here, and we'll see it again, chapter 6, right, the beginning of that, we'll see it again. You can't just continue living in sin and, and think that brings God glory in some way, in any way. Remember, we're slaves to the benevolent master, and because the master's done so much for us, we ought to do anything and everything that we can for him and not wallow around in sin. So clearly concluding things like my unrighteousness shows God's righteousness and my unrighteousness makes God's righteousness shine more clearly or something silly like that, that's just absurd. According to Paul, people that took this kind of view, as he says at the end of verse 8, their condemnation is just. He doesn't even go on to continue to answer these extreme arguments. I mean, he carried this out a bit, right? This kind of started in verse 1, and he's carried it out to now, and he kind of just cuts this one off at this point. He's like, I've reached a point now where it's just it doesn't even make sense to follow this anymore. And so he's fairly well done with that. But to summarize the key point and draw us back out of the extreme argument, God is a just God. He's not an unjust God. He is just to condemn those who are guilty of violating law. And he would be unjust to just let sin go without punishment. He's got a responsibility to judge rightly, and if he's going to be a righteous God. And so if I violated the law, he's got a responsibility to give me what I've earned. Otherwise, he's not fit for the role of judge. And we're still in the bad news part, but hopefully we're going to get in the good news part soon enough. Verses 9 to 18. In verse 9, Paul asks if the Jews are any better off. Verse 2, he had asked, I guess, a similar question where he said, what advantages did the Jews have? And he's answered that. But now he's on to, are the Jews any better off, right? Have those advantages positioned us as Jews any better for judgment? And we know that he's talking about judgment because you can skip ahead. Verse 19, he talks about all the world being held accountable before God. But I'm not going to get ahead of myself there. I see this ends at verse 18. But we know that's where he's going, okay? And we know that the answer to that question about the Jews being positioned any better for judgment is no. They're reliant on the law. The ones who are reliant on the law to save them are no better off than the Gentiles. You can look at verses 1 to 8 or so as like, do the Jews have privileges and responsibilities? You could look at those that way. And then verse 9, you could look at that as, does God play favorites because someone is a Jew? Verse 9 is the first statement of what Paul has been building toward. It's this conclusion of the argument that really began about midway through chapter 1 and has continued to this point, that all are under sin. Jews, Greeks, there's two categories, Jews or Greeks, Gentiles, whatever you consider that second category, but there's two, and they're both under sin. It's not God who's the problem. It's sin that is the problem. You can envision all of humanity being under some tyrant, let's say. And that's what sin is. That's what all these scriptures about being in bondage that we've read, not necessarily in Romans, but that we read elsewhere are all about. And Paul's about to rattle off several Old Testament references. These are indented because that's signifying their references to Old Testament passages related to that. So if all have sinned, who's sinless? No one. Are Jews sinless? Are Gentiles sinless? Nope. No. Who's held down by the cruel tyrant of sin? Everyone. Everyone is held down. So by holding a form of law as a standard, who's righteous? Nobody. No one. Verses 11 and 12, no one understand, no one's, well, let me read, I don't guess I read 9 and 10, so let's read 9 to 12. What then, are we Jews any better off? No, not at all, for we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin, as it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside, together they have become worthless, no one does what is good, not even one. The passage in verse 10 comes from Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 20. Verses 11 and 12. By the way, I'll have this on the next slide. You can take a picture of it, or I can send you the slides where all these come from. But verses 11 and 12 come from Psalm 14, 1 to 3, and Psalm 53, 1 to 3. They're two very identical passages. And then verse 11 is interesting, and it kind of helps us understand better what he's getting to. And we've talked about seeking God, seeking after his nature, trying to understand him, his ways, his very essence. And they're not doing that. No one understands, no one seeks for him. Okay? Instead of seeking him, if they're not seeking him, who are they probably seeking? Themselves, their own desires, what they want to go for, right? They're deifying themselves. They're essentially putting themselves in God's rightful position as the Lord of their lives. Verses 10 through 12 show definitively that no one is righteous. I mean, he does it in the negative way and he does it in the positive way. No one understands. No one seeks God. No one does good. Not even one. All the negative ways, right? And the positive ways. All have turned aside. Together they become worthless. He's showing every way he can that no one is justified. And again, these are coming from their own scriptures. These are coming from things that they should be familiar with. It shouldn't be a surprise to them. So they had the law, right? He's just talked about that. You had the law. He's using their own scriptures to say, I'm not telling you anything new. But he doesn't stop with that. He continues on with verse 13 and forward. And that is where we'll pick up. And when we get about to verse 21, just hang with me. We start to get to the good stuff in Romans, the good news, and it's very good stuff. So I know this has been a bit of a slog, but I appreciate you hanging with me. Thank you.